A lot of resources on how to read a scientific paper are understandably aimed at students who are studying to be scientists or researchers. I want to focus on how to read a scientific paper as a clinician. Papers are generally organized in the same way. There's a title, abstract, introduction, methods, results, discussions, conclusions, acknowledgments, and references. Sometimes discussions and conclusions are condensed together. Sometimes they're split out. The meat of the paper is this are the introduction, methods, results, and discussion. So when you look at the title and abstract, you should be thinking to yourself, do I want to read this article? Right? So based on just what the title gives you and just what's in the abstract, does this apply to your clients, to your intervention that you're interested in, to the outcome that you're interested in? Is this paper relevant to you? The introduction is going to talk about the background to this research. So, what's already been done, what's already known, and then it's going to explain what its hypothesis or research questions are. So, for you, when you're reading this, the things you should be thinking about are, was there a good reason to do this study? And so, what were the research questions or hypotheses? And really, it comes down to what's their thesis statement. So, a research study is done to fill some sort of knowledge gap. And it's usually small and precise, right? So we know that this intervention works in this population, but we want to test it in this other population. That's the knowledge gap we're going to fill. Or we know that this intervention works when it's implemented in one way. We're going to implement the same intervention a different way. That's the knowledge gap that they're filling. So you want to find what that knowledge gap is specifically that they're filling and decide whether it's relevant to you and your clinical practice. Uh, the methods section is going to explain how they did the study. And for a clinician, I think the most important parts are how they operationalized things. So how they operationalized the intervention. So what they actually did with the clients and how they measured the outcomes. So what specifically did they measure and what conclusions were they using that to draw, right? You want to know, could someone else repeat this study? If they didn't give you enough information to implement the intervention in your own clinic, this paper isn't going to do you a whole lot of good. Or if they don't tell you how they measured the outcomes, this paper probably isn't going to do you a whole lot of good. The other thing you want to look at is what kind of study design was used. Is this an experimental study where they randomly assigned people to different groups, or was this an observational study where they were looking at what happens in the course of regular clinical practice? The results section, that's where they're going to present the data that they found and apply that and test differences between groups if they had different groups. Here you want to look at, did they actually answer the questions or test the hypotheses that they presented in the introduction? You'd be surprised how many papers don't actually answer the research questions that they originally presented in the introduction. The other thing you want to look at is, are these results clinically significant? So maybe they found a difference between the two groups, but it's really tiny. So what this new intervention that they're testing doesn't really make much difference compared to the more traditional practice. And this idea of clinical significance is something that we're going to come back to multiple times over the course of the semester. The discussions and conclusions, that's where the authors are going to interpret the data that they found, right? These results. So what do they think their results mean? The discussions and conclusions is also where the authors talk about the limitations in their study. So what were the limitations that they felt they had in their methods, how they implemented the intervention, or how they measured the outcomes, or how they chose their sample of participants. So the actual mechanics of reading an article, when you download an article from a database, start just by skimming the article. So look at the abstract, look at the title, decide if this is something that you're really going to be interested in. Look for terms and techniques that you're unfamiliar with. So what you'll find is that things like statistical analyses have lots of different names for the same thing. So you'll need to find out what are the terms, techniques they're using. Do you need to look them up? Start writing down questions for things you don't understand. Now go back, look at the study more carefully. And I tend to focus on the last part of the introduction where they talk about their research questions or hypotheses and the methods and results, where they talk about what they did and how they did it and what they found. I'm a visual thinker. I like to draw the study design out. So what happened at each step. And I like to look at the graphs and tables, figures, try to figure out what I think they found. Now, when you're reading, you want to ask yourself questions about the study, right? So what are the research questions or hypotheses? Did they really identify a gap in the knowledge? What kind of study was this? Did they describe it well enough that it could be repeated? And over the course of the semester, we're going to talk about how to answer all of these kinds of questions. So overall, you want to be engaged in active reading, right? So highlight parts of the text that you find interesting or important. Draw out procedures and the flow of the study. Annotate, write margin notes about what things mean. And as you're reading, think about what else might explain their results. So they did this study, they had a hypothesis for what was going to happen and why it was going to happen. They think their intervention is going to produce some change in the participants. But what other explanations can you think of? What possibilities are they eliminating, right? So when we talk about a controlled study, that means that they're controlling or eliminating some potential explanations. What are those things that they eliminated? And where do the results apply, right? So what populations were involved in the study? If they did a study on kids in elementary school, that may not apply to older adults, right? What's their population? What environments do these apply in? How far do you think they can stretch?